Hey guys, Overlord Prime here, bringing you another video. Today we're going to be talking about Tier 10 tank destroyers and their viability in the Wargaming League. Tank destroyers are rarely used in the format, however, with the new changes to Tier 10, we're starting to see them pop up here or there. And to understand why, we must understand what tank destroyers bring to the table. They have excellent camo values, great DPM, high alpha and damage, and sometimes armor. However, their main trade-offs are limited gun traverse and typically lower than normal HP when compared to heavies and sometimes mediums. However, there are three big reasons as to why tank destroyers are rarely picked. First off, there are typically better alternatives. For example, the E100 offers 2700 HP, great armor, and a 750 damage gun. Another example is the 215B, which is the British Tier 10 Heavy, which has excellent DPM, great gun accuracy and handling, along with 2500 HP, which is one of the highest values for the heavy tanks. Secondly, tank destroyers that rely on camo values don't fare well in the format, mostly due to the nature of the engagements, where fights are typically done around corners or in very close proximity to each other, negating one of the greatest strengths of those tank destroyers. And finally, other tank destroyers that have armor have to either rely on having excessive amounts of it, or they may as well not have any armor at all. And the reason being that a lot of premium rounds are fired in this format, which completely negates a lot of the armor you see in a lot of scenarios. And first we'll be looking at the tank destroyers that have not really been used too often. We'll be saving the E3 and the Waffenträger for last, simply because, they're currently the most commonly used, and we'll explain later. So first, we have the E4. And instantly, many players will tell you that the E4 should not be used because the E100 is better. And now, up here, I have a comparison between the E100s and the E4. And most players are correct. That is because while the E4 is a tank destroyer, the E100 basically does what the E4 is doing, but doing a way better job. And that comes because the E100 has more HP, has armor, and has the same 750 damage gun that the E4 does. However, in return, the E4 does have a few benefits, but these benefits don't really make it more viable. And that is, it has a very marginal rate of fire bonus at 0.08 rounds per minute, has APCR as its premium round, which means it has extremely good travel time, and has slightly better gun accuracy. There are small marginal improvements such as slightly higher top speed with slightly higher engine power. However, mobility in these tank destroyers aren't really great enough to really, work against that E100 and all of its strengths. Next, we'll be looking at the British tank destroyers, which is something that we have been seeing used occasionally. And in order to see why they're used, we'll have to first look at the gun. As you can see here, the most interesting thing about the British tank destroyers is they only have 2 rate of fire, which means they fire once every about 30 seconds, and including rammer and all the food and perks and bonuses, it goes down to about 20-25 seconds or so. Which means it has a very long downtime after every shot. To combine with that, you also have to notice that these tanks have very poor gun handling. Both the 4005 and the FV215B 183 have very awful accuracy and very awful aim time. Many players will tell you to use the Hesh round, which has 1750 damage, but the big problem with this round is that while it does do a lot of damage per shot, it also suffers that it only has 230 millimeters of penetration. So combining that 230 millimeters of penetration, the very bad gun handling, you have a tank that's very finicky. And it's often called a lottery cannon because you don't know whether or not you're going to hit that weak spot of the enemy and do the full amount of damage, or you're just going to splash on their armor and only dish 600 to 700 damage. So in a tank that relies solely on hitting weak spots, at enemies in engagements upwards of 200 meters, it becomes very finicky and unreliable. And for this reason, you'll rarely see 183s and 4005s used in the current format, as they don't offer too much in terms of damage output and reliability. Up next, we go to the Russian tank destroyers, which is the 263 and the 268. Now, it's interesting when you talk about these tanks because, on one hand, the 263 offers speed and armor, while the 268 offers speed and camouflage. Now, as we said earlier, you either have enough armor that it bounces even premium rounds, and we also discussed a tidbit about camouflage and how it's very unlikely that camouflage is going to be viable in the current format, simply because most engagements are going to be done close range, and you'll rarely ever see a chance to utilize it. Now, if you look at the 263, you notice something about the gun. It has very high rate of fire by comparison to most other tanks. And because of that, it's very good at long-term engagements where it just pummels out shot after shot. However, the problem with the 263 and 268 is that both of these tank destroyers suffer from having very small gun arc. And the 263 that relies heavily on armor has a very weak mantlet, where 300 penetrations or more can usually go straight through it and penetrate for damage, which means the armor it has, while it does work in most scenarios, suffers when you're firing at either the lower plate or the mantlet, which are very easy targets at medium to close range, which somewhat negates the entire purpose of these tanks. The 268 has the exact same problem with the limited gun arc, and as I said earlier, because it relies heavily on camouflage in a format that makes it difficult to utilize that, it's rarely seen, and it's going to be very hard to capitalize on that aspect. Combined with the limited gun arc, you're usually going to be rotating your tank left and right, and because of that reason, you're going to have a very tough time actually getting your gun on target, which makes these tanks very unwieldy. Now, the next tank, which is the French line, is the Foch 155. Now, this tank is interesting because it is the alternate autoloader of the tank destroyers. And if you look at the autoloader, it's actually fairly interesting. It does 750 damage per shot, and it has 3 shots in the drum, meaning that in one drum, it does 2,250 damage. However, the big issue with this tank destroyer is, while it does have an seemingly amazing gun on paper, it has another flaw to it. The armor relies heavily on sloping, which is easily negated by bad positioning and easily penetrated by gold rounds, combined with the fact that 1, it doesn't have good side armor, 2, it has huge weak spots on the top of it, and 3, the reverse speed is terrible, meaning if it gets into a bad scenario, you usually find yourself stuck in that situation, unable to back out. And the second biggest problem with this tank is the gun. While the autoloader may seem to be a strength in this thing, it actually becomes a flaw. Mostly because it has a 5-second intro drum. And what that means is, it takes 10 seconds to do 2,250 damage. And because it takes so long to do that much damage, you often find yourself firing once, waiting 5 seconds for the next shot, and most of the time in those 5 seconds, the enemy you just fired at will get into cover, which completely negates the auto-loading aspect of this tank destroyer. And that's funny because one of the strengths of this is an autoloader, but it becomes the greatest flaw. Because of that, the Foch 155 is more of a liability than it is a strength. You'll rarely see this used in the league for that reason alone, because it can never get this drum out to kill a tank. Finally, we'll have the JP E100, the German behemoth. Now, this tank is very similar to the British 183. The gun does an insane amount of damage. However, it does trade off a few things in return for not having an insanely powerful HESH round. It has a very high penetrating heat round that does 1050 damage, has slightly higher rate of fire for the lower damage output, it has better gun accuracy and better aim time. So in terms of gun handling and gun characteristics, it does win out against the 183. However, the big issue with this tank is it does not have any camouflage values and it is very, very slow. And because it has no camouflage values, it's very hard to surprise an enemy that spots you way before you have a chance to set up to get a shot out. And two, because it's very slow, once you are spotted, the enemy team can usually just work around your tank and completely negate your gun. Combine that with if they get close to you, they'll easily flank you without you having an opportunity to do damage back in return. Because if you can't point your gun at the enemy, you're not going to be doing any damage. And because of all these features of the tank, it's very rarely used in the league, if ever at all, because it's more of a crutch to use this tank in any lineup you can create. However, that leaves us two tank destroyers, the T110E3 American tank destroyer and the Waffenscharger E100. Now these two tank destroyers are starting to come up in these formats. They're starting to be used more and more often, and we're going to be looking at the E3 first. On an interesting note, the E3 is the non-turreted version of the E4, as many people would like to say. And because of that, it means it doesn't have that turret that you come to expect from an E4, and has limited turret traverse, or rather, limited gun arc. As a trade-off though, it does have better gun characteristics. Because it no longer has a turret, it has a higher rate of fire by almost half a round. It has better gun accuracy and better aim time. So as a trade-off from that turret, it does have a better gun, along with having better armor. And that is the reason why the E3 is used. It has an excessive amount of armor to the point where it'll bounce even premium rounds, aiming at its top weak spot and lower plate, which does penetrate occasionally, but it can get a few tricky bounces down there. And most of the time you'll see E3s used as a mobile bunker. It's used in positions where the enemy has to go in a straight line towards it, and, it puts itself in a position where you have to push into it to kill it, but also you can't ignore it because of its HP and armor and damage. So it somewhat becomes a very weird tank in a lot of situations. You either have to sacrifice wasting 20 or 30 seconds driving to an E3 to kill it, or you just let it be, let it shoot you up, and you can't really trade with it because it's very hard to penetrate, which is why you often see it used nowadays holding down positions. The other tank destroyer is the Waffenscharger E100. Now, this is a very interesting tank destroyer in general, mostly because it does not have camouflage values, it does not have speed, and it does not have armor. And these are the three traits you often see in tank destroyers. However, you still see this used often, almost all the time, in certain maps. And to understand why, we have to look at the gun. And as you can see, here it is. It's an autoloader. And it's not just any autoloader, it's typically called one of the strongest autoloaders in the game. For a 58-second reload time, it has 5 shells in the container, does 560 damage per shell, has 352 millimeters of penetration with APCR, giving it insane shell travel time, while having the shortest intro drum for a tier 10 tank destroyer at 2 seconds per shot. What this means is, this autoloader is capable of doing 2,800 damage per drum in 8 seconds. This means that the only tank in the game that can survive a full clip from a E100 is the mouse. And this is important because this means that the Waffenscharger E100 is one of the best tank destroyers for trading. And this is because it can kill another tank in 4 to 5 shots and still have 1 shot remaining, potentially. And it's important to note that in the worst case scenario, it dies in return for that trade. And the best case scenario is it survives, reloads in 58 seconds, and kills another tank the same way it just did in the beginning. And that's why the Waffenträger is used in these punishing positions, where if the enemy charges at you, you kill a tank, you reload, they either ignore you or they kill you. And either way, in the worst case scenario, you've done your job by trading your tank for one of their tanks. And that's the conclusion for these two tank destroyers, the E3 and Waffenträger E100. We can conclude these two tank destroyers as the epitome of armor and burst damage. The E3 is one of the best tank destroyers for holding down a position where the enemy must funnel into a line towards it, and the Waffenträger is one of the best tanks at trading in the worst case scenario. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, and hopefully it clarifies as to why certain tank destroyers are used, and why certain tank destroyers are completely ignored. I'll be making more videos in the future, and hopefully you guys stay tuned, and cheer for Simp. Have a good day, guys, and see you around.